Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 60-second deck and it's titled How Many Cards Could a Discard Card If a Discard Could Card Cards? And I think we're going to try to answer that question with today's deck. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from Scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. Now, really quickly, before we get into the deck tech itself, I do want to very quickly highlight some of our social media accounts. If you are interested in reaching out to us and following us, you can find us on Twitter at 13POYNZ. On Reddit, u/POYNZ13, or by email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. I am more than happy to reach out on any of those platforms. You can always send us questions. Just kind of reach out and talk to us. I'm always happy to interact with everybody. So if you're looking for updates for the videos, if you're looking for ways to give suggestions for some of the content, those are phenomenal ways to do it. However, if you're looking to more directly support our content, you can, of course, use our affiliate link with TCG Player. Any cards you purchase, once you've clicked that link, we get a little bit of kickback from, so we really do appreciate anything you purchase using our link. And if you're looking to support us even more directly, you can head on over to our Patreon page, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, where you can give us a little bit of support every month. And thanks for that support, we will give a little bit in return. So we might give you access to deck lists a week early. You might get access to the full uncut gameplay videos where you'll get the players' commentary as they're actually playing the game rather than my post commentary. You'll be able to get access to a Discord if you're interested in playing in any of the games on this channel. You are certainly welcome to sign up and do that. And then we also do give away some of the cards that we actually build around for this channel as well. So if any of that appeals to you, you are more than welcome to head over to Patreon. We really appreciate all of the support of our patrons. Right now, of course, got to give a shout out to our patron, William Swiftfoot. Thank you very much for your support. And if none of these are ways that you're looking to support the channel, you can, of course, always just like the video, subscribe. It really does help out a lot. We very recently just broke 200 subscribers, which I am very happy with. I'm very proud of that. I didn't expect we'd get there so quickly. So thank you to everyone for watching. And if you like this content but you're not subscribed, please do consider it. It does help out the channel. But with all of the introduction stuff out of the way, let's actually get into the deck tech itself. So first up, we got to talk about our random card of the week. And this random card was suggested to us by Shawn, who is a regular member of my playgroup. He shows up in a lot of the videos on this channel, and he kind of likes to make my life a little bit difficult with his suggestions for this channel. So this time, no exception. His suggested card was One with Nothing, which is 1 black mana for an instant, discard your hand. And that's it. You just discard your hand, you don't get any benefit from it, it's just 1 mana, get rid of your whole hand, and have no cards left. So I think the upside to this card, though, is that there's a lot of cards in Magic that really do want you to be discarding cards. So we're gonna see if we can make it work, but this has historically been a pretty bad card, so we'll see what we can do. But before we get into the actual deck itself, we do, of course, have to talk about our commander. And this week, our commander is going to be Crosis the Purger. Crosis is 3 blue, black, red. So we're in the Grixis colors. He's a 6/6 legendary creature dragon. He's got flying. And whenever Crosis the Purger deals combat damage to a player, you may pay 2 and a black. If you do, choose a color. Then that player reveals their hand and discards all cards of that color. So Crosis kind of just lets us pick apart our opponent's hand, especially if they're playing a monocolored deck. So that's the goal here, but I'll be perfectly honest up front, Crosis isn't really here for his ability. It's really just here for the colors and the fact that it's a massive 6/6 dragon, and sometimes we just need a huge creature on board to protect us from our opponents kind of wanting to kill us for the stuff that we're doing. So that's why Crosis is here. But with our commander's introduction out of the way, let's take a look at some of our themes for this deck. Now, the first theme, as you may have already been able to guess by our random card, the One with Nothing, we are trying to discard some cards. So anytime we've got cards in our hand, we kind of want to look at them and go, I don't really want these. I'd prefer if they were in the graveyard. So our goal is to make sure that even if we have some cards in hand, we would really like to have not that many cards in our hand. We want to pitch them all into the graveyard as much as possible, kind of keep them flowing in and out of our graveyard, and that way we can get a ton of advantage from it. Meaning something like 1 with nothing, 1 mana to discard our entire hand, can be incredibly powerful. So to add on to that, we have Awaken the Erstwhile, which is 3 black for a sorcery. Each player discards all the cards in their hand, then creates that many 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. Super useful because if we have a hand of 7 cards, we discard 7, we make 7 2/2s. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't work just for us. This is universal. It's going to hit everyone at the table. So if our opponents have hands of 7, they also get 7 2/2 zombies. But ideally, our opponents are going to have less cards than us, and then we're also going to be in a position to want to discard our hand, so we're going to be more prepared when that time comes, and we might kind of mess up our opponent's game plan. And they might get zombies, but we've probably got some way to benefit from discarding our hand in the first place. And speaking of benefiting from discarding our hand, our next theme is, of course, benefiting from discarding our hand. So there are a ton of cards that say something along the lines of, whenever you discard a card, do this thing. And we are absolutely filled up with those kind of cards in this deck. And the card here to kind of give you an example of that is Surly Badgersaur. Surly Badgersaur, 3 and a red for a 3/3 Badger Dinosaur. Whenever you discard a creature card, put a +1/+1 counter on Surly Badgersaur. Whenever you discard a land card, create a treasure token. And whenever you discard a non-creature, non-land card, Surly Badgersaur fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. So Surly Badgersaur here is going to benefit us from discarding any card in our hand, but if we partner it up with something like Awaken the Erstwhile or 1 with nothing, where we're discarding multiple cards at once, we get each of those triggers at the same time. So we can put a ton of counters on the Surly Badgersaur, make a ton of treasures, and then fight 2 or 3 things and clear away as much as we can as our Badgersaur gets bigger. So Surly Badgersaur, really an all-star for what we're trying to do, and it's definitely not the only card in the deck that does a very similar thing. So we'll see some more of those pop up in the future as well. And then finally, our last theme for the deck is going to sound a little backwards, so let me explain it to you. We want to actually draw some cards. And I know, why would we want cards in our hand if we're just going to discard them? But the reason is, we need cards in our hand to be able to discard them. So if we don't draw a ton of cards, we can't actually discard them later for something like Surly Badgersaur. And that's where cards like Blue Sun Zenith come in handy. And Blue Sun Zenith is X, blue for an instant. Target player draws X cards, shuffle Blue Sun Zenith into its owner's library. So we can essentially just pay X and triple blue and draw that many cards, which is incredibly useful because that's also an instant. We can just do it at someone's end step, draw a bunch of cards, go to our turn, discard a bunch of cards, get a ton of triggers, and just kind of move on from there. So perfect for what we're aiming to do. And like I said, you can't discard cards unless you got cards in your hand. That's the only way to answer the question of how many cards could a discard card, right? All right, but moving on from our themes, let's take a look at some key cards in this deck, some of the pieces that really help this deck run. And I realized, putting this deck together, this is my kind of deck. All of the key cards that are in here, all of the themes that are in here, I'm all about. So I was a big fan of putting this deck together. And honestly, it was difficult for me to trim our key cards down to just 3. So these 3 really are all-stars for this deck. So the first of those all-stars is going to be Nezahal Primal Tide. Nezahal is 5 blue for a legendary creature, Elder Dinosaur. It's a 7/7. This spell can't be countered. You have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, draw a card, and discard 3 cards, exile Nezahal Primal Tide, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. That is a lot of words on this dinosaur. And the nice thing about Nezahal is that every single line of text on it is relevant. It's nice that this can't be countered. It's nice that it gives us no maximum hand size, it draws us cards, and it's a free discard outlet. So we really can't go wrong with Nezahal when we're looking at the fact that not only is it extending our game plan by letting us discard cards, it's also helping us to draw cards. And I've played with Nezahal in a few decks in the past, and it almost always draws more cards than you expect. It is almost guaranteed to draw at least one, because even if someone removes it right away, you still get to draw a card from their removal spell. So it's very unlikely that you don't, at the bare minimum, just kind of cycle this card. But there's an even better chance that you just draw more cards than are expected, and you get so much value because throughout the course of a game of Commander, there are a ton of non-creature spells cast. And if you're drawing a card for every single one of them, unless your opponents really aren't playing their game plan or they're playing almost entirely creature-based decks, they're not going to be able to let you get away with this for too long, which is then where the final line of text comes in, because you can just protect Nezahal by discarding some cards. So I absolutely love this dinosaur. I think it's phenomenal. And if you're playing a blue deck, you should probably be playing Nezahal in Commander just because it is so incredibly powerful. But enough about the dinosaur. Let's move on to our next key card in the set. And the next key card is Change of Fortune. A pretty recent card came out with Crimson Vow. It's 3 and a red for a sorcery, and it says discard your hand, then draw a card for each card you've discarded this turn. Even just on its face value, this is very strong, because even if we're looking at, say we've got 5 cards in our hand, we cast a Change of Fortune, so we have 4 left, we're going to discard 4 cards, we've now discarded 4 cards, so we draw 4 cards. So at a bare minimum, it's a Wheel of Fortune effect just for us, which is pretty good. It doesn't put us all the way back up to 7 unless we already had 7 cards, but it still lets us switch out our hand for a new one. Where it gets incredibly powerful, though, is that it counts all other cards we've discarded this turn. If we've done this kind of thing 2 or 3 more times already, we've cast a Change of Fortune, or we've cast a Windfall, we've cast a Dark Petition, or we've cast any number of cards that say, like, discard your hand, draw that many cards, and say we've discarded 10 cards this turn, and we still have 5 cards in our hand. We cast a Change of Fortune, we discard the 5 cards in our hand, but now at this point, we've discarded 20 cards this turn. So we draw a total of 20 cards. Change of Fortune gets absolutely crazy really, really quickly, because all it really takes is one extra Wheel of Fortune effect, and all of a sudden, you're doubling your hand size. And in Commander, doubling your hand size is an incredibly powerful thing to do. So I absolutely love Change of Fortune. I wish I had played with it more often after seeing how it synergizes with a lot of cards in Commander especially. So big fan of Change of Fortune, and I'm super excited to see what it can do in this deck when we're kind of built around that exact thing. And finally, we have our last key card, and that is Bralin Sky Shark Rider. Again, a personal favorite of mine. I absolutely love Bralin. Bralin is 3 and a red for a legendary creature, Human Shaman, 3/3. He partners with Shabraz the Sky Shark. Now, Shabraz is unfortunately blue and white, so it can't fit into this deck. So, Bralin's partnerless for this one, unfortunately. But he's pretty darn good on his own. So he says, whenever you discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Bralin Sky Shark Rider, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent. And pay a red. Target shark gains trample until end of turn. Again, that last line of text probably not going to be useful. Honestly, I don't think we have any sharks in this deck, but you never know. Maybe something comes up where our opponent has a big shark and we can squeeze through trample damage on someone else. But the important part is that second line of text. Whenever you discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Bralin, so we can get Bralin to be super big, super quick, because even if we just have Nezahal on board with Bralin, discard 3 cards, put 3 counters on him, all of a sudden Bralin's a 6/6. And it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So again, we discard those 3 cards with Nezahal. Not only is Bralin now a 6/6, but we just did 3 damage to each opponent. That's 9 damage worth of, well, damage just for discarding 3 cards. So Brolin can be an absolute threat very, very quickly. And with something like Change of Fortune, where we're discarding 10, 15, 20 cards, Brolin can be lethal. So it doesn't take much for Brolin to be able to start knocking people out of the game, because even if someone's at a slightly higher life total than everybody else, maybe they survive all the discard pings, we then have just a massive beater in Brolin. Because we discard 10 cards, we got a 13-13 human shaman there. And yeah, it doesn't have trample, unfortunately, but there's not so much our opponents are going to be able to do with a giant Brolin coming their way. So I absolutely love Brolin. I could sit here and talk about any of these key cards all day if I really wanted to, but I do think we got to move on, unfortunately, get into some of our cool interactions for this deck. So we're going to talk about some cards that work super well together in this deck and things that really kind of help us further our game plan, some synergies, you might say. So the first of these cool interactions is between Riel the Everwise and Ancient Excavation. So Riel the Everwise is 1 blue-red for a human wizard 0/3. Riel gets +1/+0 for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. Pretty good if we're discarding cards. And whenever you discard 1 or more cards for the first time each turn, draw that many cards. So if we go back to Nezahal, discard 3 cards, we would then draw 3 cards. So Riel is super, super powerful in this deck, because it essentially means that the first time we discard each turn, it's like we didn't do it at all. We still refill our hand, and that kind of makes our deck super powerful. So Riel is an all-star even just on her own. But if we partner her up with something like Ancient Excavation, which is 2 blue-black for an instant, draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand, then discard a card for each card drawn this way. And it also does have basic land cycling too, so if for some reason we have this early on and we're kind of getting screwed over on our colors, we can always cast it, get a land that we need. But really the key here is to cast it. And the nice thing is it's an instant, so we can actually cast it on someone else's turn and still trigger Riel, meaning that if we have 5 cards in our hand, we cast this, we draw 5 cards, we now go to 10 cards in our hand. We discard 5 cards because we just drew 5, go back down to 5, and then Riel sees us discard 5 cards and draws us 5 more cards, so we go back up to 10 cards in our hand. We can essentially double the amount of cards in our hand every time we cast Ancient Excavation, plus we get to see a ton of cards in our deck. Because we just drew 5, discarded 5, and then drew 5 more, we got 10 cards deep into our deck. We can kind of pick and choose at that point what we're keeping and what we're not. And especially since we're trying to discard cards, if we don't like any of the cards in our hand, then we'll just throw them away. So Ancient Excavation on its own, very good card. I love putting this in a lot of decks, but in this deck, and especially with Riel, it shines even more. So big fan of these 2 cards, like I said, separately, but an even bigger fan of them together. And then we're going to get into our second cool interaction for this deck. And this one is a little bit different because we're going to be talking about the Locust God and Dire Undercurrents. And if you're looking for a 2-card win the game combo, this is it. And I know it's kind of hard not to have a win the game combo with the Locust God, but we still managed to do it even on a budget, which is nice. So the Locust God, 4 blue-red for a legendary creature, God, 4/4, flying. Whenever you draw a card, create a 1/1 blue and red insect creature token with flying and haste, and you can pay 4, draw a card, then discard a card. And when the Locust God dies, return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So this is great because obviously we're going to be discarding a bunch of cards, drawing a bunch of cards. That makes us a bunch of 1/1 insects with flying and, more importantly, haste because they're able to attack the turn we create them. And if we partner that up with Dire Undercurrents, which we'll explain how this wins the game in just a second, Dire Undercurrents is an enchantment for 3 and a hybrid Dimir. Whenever a blue creature comes into play under your control, you may have target player draw a card. Whenever a black creature comes into play under your control, you may have target player discard a card. So you could use this on your opponents, help someone draw cards, make your opponents discard cards. But the reason it goes infinite with the Locust God is because if we draw a card, we make a 1/1 blue and red insect creature with flying and haste. That is a blue creature, triggers Dire Undercurrents, meaning that we can then have ourselves draw a card, which, when we draw a card, makes us another insect. So with these 2 cards on the board, we draw our entire deck, and because it's a May ability from Dire Undercurrents, we can stop whenever we want. We draw our entire deck, and then for each card that we just drew in our deck, so say we have 80 cards in our deck, we have now made 80 1/1 blue and red insect creature tokens with flying and haste. And at that point, if we can't find a way to win with our entire deck in our hands and all of these different insects, then we're a little bit out of luck. But you can always leave 1 or 2 cards in your library so you have a couple of turns if you need it. But this is a great way to just knock people out of the game, because 80 insects kills 2 people from their starting life total right there. And I imagine there's been a little bit of damage done to people. You've probably got some other things on board. You, of course, have the Locust God. So there's a good chance you're still able to win. But it is something to keep in mind that Dire Undercurrents is a May, so stop when you feel like you've kind of hit that point. You don't want to go too far and have someone force you to draw a card so then they knock you out of the game. But this is a 2-card win the game combo if that's something you're looking to pull off. And those are our key interactions for this week, or our cool interactions, I suppose I should say. They're not necessarily key. This one might be. But that brings us to the price of our deck for this week. Since we are a budget deck, we're looking at $95.05 out of our $100 budget limit. And the most expensive card, and I try not to do this, but I had to make an exception this week. We've already talked about it. It's Dire Undercurrents, the most expensive card in here. Obviously, if you're looking to exchange this out for something else, you definitely can. There are other cards that do the same kind of thing. There's even other cards that go infinite with Locust God that are super cheap. I think it's called Sage of the Falls is one, for example. I think that's only about 35 cents. But if you're looking for a card that draws cards and helps discard cards, there's not a ton out there for it. And I don't want to talk too much about Dire Undercurrents here because we did just talk about it. So if you're looking to cut it, it could be a good cut. If not, then let's talk about our second most expensive card in here, because I think that kind of shows the difference between our most expensive at $12 and our second most expensive, which is only $7.76. Still not super cheap, but there is a big price difference between the top card and the next one down. So our next one down is Bone Miser, which is 4 and a black for a zombie wizard. It's a 4/4. Whenever you discard a creature card, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Whenever you discard a land card, add black. Whenever you discard a non-creature, non-land card, draw a card. So Bone Miser, very similar to Surly Badgersaur, really benefits us for just discarding anything and gives us a benefit from discarding each thing specifically. So if it's land, we get mana. If it's a non-creature, non-land, we draw a card. If it's a creature, we get a zombie. So no matter what we discard, we get some sort of benefit. So Bone Miser is amazing, and I would highly recommend you try not to cut this out of the deck if you can avoid it. But if you can't, there are other cards that didn't quite make the cut that do benefit you from discarding cards. And if that doesn't work either, you can always just put more discard outlets into the deck because that's always going to be relevant. So that is our deck for this week. The last bit of this, and this is going to look a little bit different for those of you that have been watching for a while. We're going to talk a little bit about some out-of-budget upgrades, some cards that could be included in this deck that I didn't unfortunately have the budget space for. And normally, we just talk about those cards. But recently, I got a suggestion to start talking about the cards that we would put in and the card that we would take out if given the opportunity to help people who want to make that one-to-one switch and are interested in trying out the deck with the upgrades. So our first one then, we have our out-of-budget upgrade plus the card that I would replace in the deck. And in this case, it's going to be a brand new card from Streets of New Capenna. It's a currency converter. 1 mana for an artifact. Whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard. Then you can pay 2, tap, draw a card, then discard a card. And you can tap, put a card exiled with Currency Converter into your graveyard. If it's a land, make a treasure token. If it's a non-land, make a 2/2 black rogue creature token. So this again benefits us from discarding cards, But this one lets us pick and choose. Do we want to put a card exiled into our graveyard that's a land so we can make a treasure? Or do we want to make a rogue? So super useful. Plus it does have the loot effect on it, being able to draw and then discard. So if we need to kickstart any of our cards, something like Locust God, Currency Converter, phenomenal. It is, however, $5.76, which I know is still cheaper than our two most expensive cards in the deck. But with the end budget of the deck, I wasn't able to squeeze it in. And so if you're looking to replace something in the actual deck, we are running Venser's Journal, which is 5 mana for an artifact. You have no maximum hand size. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you gain 1 life for each card in your hand. Venser's Journal, still a very powerful card, but after having played this deck, I don't think it's as strong in this deck as I wanted it to be originally, because drawing the cards is great, but we also want to be discarding our cards. So there's a good chance we're not going to have a ton of cards in our hand every turn to gain the life from, so it doesn't put in as much work as you might expect. And being able to trim down a 5 mana card for a 1 mana card kind of helps the fluidity of the deck and helps it run a little bit smoother. And then our second out-of-budget upgrade, because we only got 2 this week, is going to be Seagate Restoration, and we would swap that out for an island. So Seagate Restoration is 4 blue for a sorcery. Draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1. You have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. So again, very useful. It's a permanent effect on it, which is phenomenal. We don't have to keep around like a mana rock or a land or something to give us no max hand size. We just get it for good. And it doesn't discard cards, but it does draw us a ton of cards. And I know you might be thinking, but Zach, why would you swap out a sorcery for an island? And the quick answer is because Seagate Restoration is, of course, a modal double-faced card, and on the back of it, it's a land. And as Seagate Reborn enters the battlefield, you can pay 3 life. If you don't, it enters tapped, and it taps for a blue. So you can put it in a land slot to help your deck run a little bit smoother. So if you need the land, it's there. But if you don't need the land, then you have the sorcery, and it kind of helps you from flooding out a little bit. So that is why I would personally just replace an island. But as you can see, the difference between a 3-cent island and a $15 Seagate is pretty big. And that's not something I could squeeze into the budget of this deck. However, if you're building it yourself or you just have a Seagate that you would like to put in, this is a swap that I would recommend making. But that now officially brings us to the end of our deck tech. And the last thing we've got to do is, of course, see how this deck works in a game. So we can talk about this deck all we want, but we can't really do anything about it until we see it in action. So this week, we are going to test out this deck against 3 opponents. Runo Stromkirk, being played by Jason, Atraxa Praetor's Voice, being played by Bilal, and Greasefang Okiba Boss, being played by Shawn. So starting with Runo, Runo Stromkirk, of course, Vampire Cleric, but the key to this, and you can't quite get the gist of it from the front of this card, so let's take a look at the back of this card. Once this card transforms, we get Crosis, Lord of the Deep, and this is where Jason's deck shines. Whenever Crosis, Lord of the Deep attacks, you create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of another creature. If that creature is a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent, make 2 of those tokens instead. So Jason's deck is a Dimir, Kraken, Sea Monster, Leviathan tribal deck. So he wants to play as many big serpents as he can and just kind of slam into his opponents. And then once he can get Crosis and start making copies, and in fact making 2 copies of each of his creatures, he's probably going to be pretty hard to stop. So I do think that we're going to have to make sure we don't let Jason get a ton of mana so he can get his creatures on board. And that's probably going to be our issue with that deck. I think if we can be a little faster, we'll be fine. But in the late game, I'm a little worried about some of his creatures. Next up, we have Bilal's Atraxa Praetor's Voice deck, which is a Super Friends deck, mainly because of her second line of text that says at the beginning of your end step, proliferate. So he wants to get as many planeswalkers into play as he can, and then start ticking up their loyalties with Atraxa, protecting them with some other creatures that he may have on board, and other effects like that. So a bit control-y. He wants to take control of the game with his planeswalkers. I don't think that we're going to be too hindered by what he's doing unless he gets something like a Narset Parter of Veils that stops us from drawing cards. So as long as we can avoid that, we'll probably be mostly okay against the Atraxa deck. And then finally, we have Shawn's Greasefang deck, which I am very excited to see. I haven't actually seen a Greasefang deck before, and I am a big fan of vehicles. You may know this, but I have a Depala deck that is one of my personal favorites. I'm a big fan of vehicles in all colors, so being able to see Greasefang in some Orzhov vehicles, definitely looking forward to it, because Greasefang plays a little bit differently than most other vehicle decks, because it's not just like play vehicles, smash into your opponents. It's play vehicles, smash into your opponents. Oh, you killed my vehicles? I guess I'll just reanimate them. And Greasefang really wants to get vehicles in the graveyard that are too expensive to cast. So I'm a little worried that Shawn's going to put some massive creatures into play very, very quickly thanks to Greasefang and its ability, and we're not going to be able to keep up with the amount of like 4/4s and 5/5s that keep slamming into us every single turn because Greasefang just keeps reanimating a ton of vehicles. So honestly, I think out of all of these, I'm most worried about Greasefang in the beginning of the game, and I'm most worried about Runo at the late game. But I still wouldn't be surprised to see Atraxa take over because that's just kind of what Atraxa does. So I think we have some very powerful opponents this week, and I'm very excited to see how this game goes, especially because I've never seen Runo or Greasefang in action, so it should be a good time. But I hope you all enjoyed the video as well, and I will talk to y'all at the wrap-up once everything is done. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by Bilal, myself, and then Shawn. On Jason's first turn, he plays a Swamp and casts Soul Ring. Bilal plays a Scalding Tarn, sacrificing it to search his library for a tropical island, and then cast Birds of Paradise. I play a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1. Shawn plays an Orzhov Guildgate. Jason casts Commander Sphere and then plays a Salt Marsh tapped. Bilal plays a Godless Shrine tapped. I play an island and then cast a Rakdos Signet. Shawn plays a Forsaken Sanctuary. Jason plays an island and casts Dimir Keyrune. Bilal plays a Temple Garden untapped, paying 2 life, and then casts his commander Atraxa Praetor's Voice, proliferating on his end step. I cast a Faith of the Devoted, allowing me to pay 1 mana whenever I discard a card to make each opponent lose 2 life while I gain 2 life. I then play a Dimir Aqueduct, returning an island to my hand. Shawn plays a Swamp and casts Raider's Carve, which has a crew 3. Jason casts Kiora Best the Sea God, making an 8/8 Kraken with Hexproof. Bilal casts Ashiok Dreamrender, preventing his opponents from searching their libraries, and then activates Ashiok's -2 ability to mill Shawn for 4, and then exile each opponent's graveyard. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 4 with Atraxa, gaining 4 life, and then in his end step he proliferates, adding another counter to Ashiok. I play an island and cast Bone Miser, allowing me to make a 2/2 zombie if I discard a creature, 2 black mana if I discard a land, or draw a card when I discard a non-creature non-land. Shawn plays a Plains and casts his commander Greasefang Okiba Boss. He uses Greasefang to crew the Carve, attacking Bilal for 4, allowing Shawn to look at the top card of his library and put it into play if it's a land, which it is, so he puts a Plains into play. Bilal then blocks the Carve with his commander, killing both creatures. When Jason draws, Kiora Best the Sea God triggers, tapping all of my non-land permanents and not allowing them to untap on my next untap step. He then moves to combat, attacking Ashiok for 8, killing the Planeswalker. Then, in his second main phase, he casts a Trench Behemoth, allowing him to return a land to his hand to untap the Behemoth and give it hexproof for the turn, and also forcing an opponent's creature to attack when he plays a land. Bilal casts a Narset Transcendent, activating her +1 ability to look at the top card of his library, revealing it and putting it into his hand if it's a non-creature non-land. Unfortunately, it's not, so it stays on top of his deck. I play a swamp and cast Diabolic Tutor, searching my library for a card and putting it into my hand. Shawn casts Weatherlight, which has Crew 3, and moves to combat, triggering Greasefang, returning Raider's Carve from his graveyard to play. He crews the Carve with Greasefang and uses it to attack Narset for 4, triggering the Carve, but this time the top card is not a land, so it stays on top, and then the Carve returns to his hand. When Jason draws for turn, Kiora Best the Sea God triggers, gaining him control of Narset and also sending the Saga to the graveyard. He activates Narset's +1 ability, looking at the top card of his library but not revealing it so it stays on top. He then attacks Bilal for 7 and Shawn for 8. In his second main phase, he casts Aether Squall Ancient, gaining 3 energy in his upkeep and allowing him to spend 8 energy to return all other non-land permanents to their owner's hand. He then plays a Dimir Guildgate and passes. Bilal plays the World Tree and passes. I play a mountain and cast Nezahal Primal Tide, giving me no maximum hand size, drawing me a card whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, and allowing me to discard 3 cards to exile it and return it to play tapped in the next end step. I then attack Bilal for 4 and pass. Shawn casts Cultivator's Caravan, which has Crew 3, drawing me a card with Nezahal. He recasts Raider's Carve, drawing me another card, and then crews the Weatherlight with Greasefang, attacking me for 4, looking at the top 5 cards of his library when it deals damage, and revealing a Foundry Inspector, putting it into his hand. In Jason's upkeep, he gets 3 energy from the Ancient, and then activates Narset's +1 ability, looking at the top card of his library, and, once again, leaving it there on top. He then plays a Dismal Backwater, gaining a life, and moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 6 in the air and me for 8 on the ground. Bilal plays a Bloodstained Mire, sacrificing it to search his library for a Zagoth Triome and put it into play tapped. He then casts Kaya the Inexorable, drawing me a card, and activates Kaya's -3 ability to exile Jason's Trench Behemoth, but, in response, Jason activates the Behemoth, returning an island to his hand, tapping the Kraken, and giving it hexproof until end of turn. On my turn, I play a Mountain, and attack Kaya for 4, killing the Planeswalker. Then in my second main phase, I cast Cavalier of Flame, discarding 5 cards when it enters, drawing a total of 8 cards, making a zombie token, and generating 2 black mana. Once that resolves, I cast Change of Fortune to discard my hand and draw cards equal to the number of cards I've discarded this turn, but in response, Jason casts Dimir Charm to counter it since it's a sorcery spell. This does, however, draw me a card with Nezahal. Shawn casts a Peace Walker Colossus, allowing him to pay 2 mana to turn his vehicles into creatures, and this also draws me a card. He then uses the Peace Walker to crew the Carve, and uses Greasefang to crew Cultivator's Caravan. He attacks Narset for 5, killing her, and Jason for 4. This allows him to look at the top card of his library, and he leaves it there. In Jason's upkeep, he gains 3 energy, and then plays a Swamp, triggering Trench Behemoth, forcing my Bone Miser to attack on my next turn if able, and he moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 13 total damage. On Bilal's turn, he casts Time Wipe, returning Birds of Paradise to his hand and destroying all other creatures. This draws me a card with Nezahal, and I then discard 3 lands to exile Nezahal, returning him to play at the end of turn. This also makes me 6 black mana, so I use 3 of it to pay for Faith of the Devoted, making each of my opponents lose 6 life while I gain 6. Then the board wipe resolves, wiping away all creatures, and since this kills Cavalier of Flame, I do 4 damage to each opponent since there are 4 lands in my graveyard. Then Bilal recasts his Birds of Paradise, and Nezahal returns to play tapped in Bilal's end step. On my turn, I cast Bralin Skyshark Rider, which does 1 damage to each opponent, and gets a +1/+1 counter every time I discard a card. I then cast Thought Vessel, giving me no maximum hand size, and attack Jason for 7. Shawn casts a Foundry Inspector, making all his artifacts cost 1 less, and uses Peace Walker to crew the Carve, and Foundry Inspector to crew Weatherlight. He then attacks me for 8, triggering the carve, looking at the top card of his library and leaving it on top. Then, when the Weatherlight hits me, he looks at the top 5 cards of his library, revealing an Aerial Surveyor and putting it into his hand. Jason casts his commander, Runo Stromkirk, putting Aethersquall Ancient from his graveyard onto the top of his library. He then plays an island and casts Reanimate, returning Trench Behemoth from his graveyard to play and losing 7 life since its mana value is 7. Bilal plays a command tower and recasts his commander Atraxa. Then, in his end step, he proliferates Jason's energy counter, and, still in Bilal's end step, I cycle a Curator of Mysteries, paying 1 for Faith of the Devoted, which ends up doing 3 damage to each opponent, while I gain 2 and put a counter on Brawlin. On my turn, I cast Glinthorn Buccaneer, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever I discard a card, and I attack Shawn for 4 with Brawlin. Shawn recasts his commander, Greasefang, and crews Raider's Carve with the Founder Inspector. He then moves to combat, triggering Greasefang to return Parhelion 2 from the graveyard to the battlefield, immediately crewing it with Greasefang. He then attacks me with everything, making 2 4/4 Angels on attack with the Parhelion, and looking at the top card of his library with the Carve, putting it into play since it's a land. I block the Carve with Nezahal, killing the vehicle, and then I take 13 total damage. Before Shawn moves to his end step, though, I activate Nezahal, discarding 3 cards and paying 3 for the Faith of the Devoted, doing a total of 12 damage to each opponent, while I gain 6 life and put 3 +1/+1 counters on Brawlin. This winds up killing both Jason and Bilal, allowing me to bring Nezahal back in Shawn's end step, discard 3 more cards on my turn, doing another 12 damage to Shawn, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Everyone's deck really did what it wanted to do, and I was very impressed with everyone. Unfortunately for Bilal, he did get a little stuck on lands, but even getting stuck on lands, he still played Narset. He was still able to get some Planeswalkers on board like Kaya that influenced the game and really changed the way that things were working. So even with all of that, even with the lack of lands, his deck still performed very well. He just unfortunately couldn't find a way to protect his board against the onslaught of discard, vehicles, and Leviathans. Which, speaking of Leviathans, Jason's deck really just churned out a ton of big monsters very, very quickly. The fact that he spent the first 3 turns ramping and then started dropping 7-drop after 7-drop after 7-drop, and just use them to kind of beat in each other's faces, made the Runo deck look very, very strong. And I think that if I hadn't been able to win on the turn that I won, I think Jason really could have started to get out of hand, because there wasn't much any of us could do to stop those massive creatures. And then also, looking at Shawn's deck for the Greasefang deck, also very impressive. I think that Peace Walker Colossus, as with any vehicle deck, absolute all-star. But I was very impressed by how quickly he was able to get a board of vehicles that just kept swinging and kept getting some form of value. So Weatherlight, Raider's Carve, being able to get extra lands, being able to hit extra draws for the turn, really just shows the power of some vehicles when put all together. And I'm very, very happy with how that deck turned out. And I'm looking forward to playing against it in the future. Especially because my wife actually just recently built a Greasefang Pioneer deck, so I've been getting my butt kicked by that in Pioneer as well. So it's something that has continued to show up and continued to kind of beat me down, so I'm very happy to see it in Commander now as well. And finally, I guess to wrap up with our own deck, the deck really overperformed. It did exactly what it wanted to do, drew a ton of cards, discarded a ton of cards, and it was absolutely crazy that at the end of the game, every card we discarded, as long as we paid 1 mana, was doing 6 damage to each opponent. That is wild, crazy value, because what can you do to stop that, you know? If your opponent's doing 6 damage to you every time they discard a card, and we had a Nezahal, so we're able to discard 3 cards whenever we wanted, and even if discarding 3 wasn't enough, we can discard 3 to Nezahal wait with the trigger on the stack, do it again. So we could discard as many cards as we wanted at that point, as long as they were in increments of 3, and just do a massive, massive amount of damage to each opponent. So absolutely very impressed by our deck. I think that the cards worked super well together. It was a shame we didn't get to actually see one with nothing, but I think that even if we had, it would have kind of just been the same outcome, because we were still just doing so much damage with our discard. So very happy with the deck, very happy with the game. If you are interested in seeing more like this in the future, please do like the video. Helps me know that people are enjoying the content. And subscribe if you're not already subscribed. It does help out the channel quite a bit. And as always, if you have any suggestions for future videos, or if you have cards that you would like to see made into videos, they can be your own personal pet cards, they can be your favorite commanders, they can be whatever. They can even be, the worst card you've ever heard of, like Shawn tried to do for this video, because hey, maybe it'll still wind up making a winning deck. But please do leave those suggestions in the comments, or if you're interested, sending them to us on Twitter, Reddit, email, whatever. But with all of that being said, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.